Hey everybody. So today we are going to discuss the cone of vision. We're going to talk about the who, what's, when, where, how, and whys of the cone of vision. This is a very important tool that we can use in order to determine in linear perspective how distorted something is, or what field of view it is, or what lens it's using. Okay. So the cone of vision it has nothing to do with plotting anything. Its main use is just for us to fact check our work. So when we create a sketch and we want a specific feeling and we need a specific lens, or we start with an idea and we know that we want to use a specific lens and we haven't created the sketch yet, then we would employ the cone of vision in all of its technical aspects, or estimated aspects, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. We will employ that tool in order to give us an idea of how distorted the space is and what lens we're using when calculating perspective technically. Now this is very important. The cone of vision does not exist without the other elements of perspective. If I am not actually measuring space, then the cone of vision means nothing to me. So I actually have to measure space in order for the cone of vision to be useful. Okay, so if I just created a sketch and I didn't really care about foreshortening, I didn't really care about lenses or how distorted the space was, then the cone of vision doesn't matter. So if you were in a math class, and unfortunately this is like the best analogy I can come up with, if you were in a math class and you were done with your test and you had 10 minutes left, your teacher would tell you to check your answers to see if they're correct. And to check it, you basically reverse engineer the math equation, the expression that you have found an answer for every answer that you've given, just to make sure that it's correct. So if I already start with a sketch and I have decided on a lens, what I'll do is I'll reverse engineer it in order to check to see if my answer is correct, to see if that lens is really what I decided it should be. And then on the flip side, I could actually create the cone of vision or the expression right off the bat. So if I create it right off the bat and then I develop the 3D grid and then I draw within inside of that grid, I will know that everything that I draw inside that grid is incorrect perspective, or at least based on my decisions, it's correct, right? So if I decide on a more fisheye lens, then that would be the correct lens, but I have to know what field of view I'm using by creating a cone of vision in order for me to accurately determine that that is in fact a wide angle lens, or what we call a short lens, or that is in fact a long lens or a standard lens, so on and so forth. So with the cone of vision, so I've said all this stuff, I've kind of qualified and quantified what a cone of vision is and what its uses are, and what you don't use it for, right? So I wouldn't use it if I'm not calculating perspective technically, or even estimating technical perspective. So with that said, I'm jumping back and forth a little bit here, but if I could also not just technically create a cone of vision to determine perspective, but there are ways around technically creating a perspective grid that still somewhat accurately will portray the depth correctly, and the cone of vision will still be useful. So there are tricks and there are shortcuts that we can use when sketching that will give us a good estimate of our lens type without actually creating the technical linear perspective grid in its entirety. So we'll discuss all this stuff in here as I move forward. So with that said, the cone of vision does not exist without the center of vision. So I call the cone of vision COV, call the center of vision the CV. The center of vision is exactly what it seems like it is, right? So let's go ahead and bring out our terms list here. So the center of vision is the area on the picture plane where the center line and the horizon line intersect. This is the only place in perspective, in a perspective image that is shared between all views. That's topographic elevation, front, back, left, right sides, and the perspective view. This is the only place in all of those views that is shared. And that's important for many reasons, but we'll just say that the cone of vision is where the line of sight meets the picture plane. And it just so happens that where the line of sight meets the picture plane, that's where you're going to find your horizon line and your center line. But only if the line of sight is parallel to the ground, right? So if we move up here, the line of sight needs to be parallel to the ground in order for our horizon line and our center line to meet. If this line is up or down and it is not parallel to the ground, then the horizon line is still going to be at the eye, but the center of vision will change. So this is essentially the center line. It divides left and right of the viewer, and the horizon line divides up and down, above the viewer's eye and below the viewer's eye. So with that said, we have a center line that is completely vertical, which is perpendicular or 90 degrees from the line of sight. Also, the horizon line is perpendicular and 90 degrees from the line of sight. And the horizon line and the center line are 90 degrees from each other. So the center line is squared with the picture plane, and it is perfectly vertical. And the horizon line is squared with the picture plane and is perfectly horizontal. Let's talk about the station point because we need that next, right? So if we look at our list, we have our center of vision. Now that we know where that's at, we can look at our station point, and then we'll talk about our distance line. So our CV, our SP, or our station points, is basically where our eye is. So our eye is a specific distance from the canvas or the picture plane, where the center of vision meets is where the line of sight intersects with the picture plane. So we have our station point, which is basically where the feet are planted, although I guess we can measure it from where the feet are planted, but that's not really where we are measuring from. We're measuring from the eye, but essentially if you took the same distance from the feet to the picture plane or the ground line that you took from the eye to the center of vision, you'd have the same distance. The station point is the area where the viewer resides relative to and from the picture plane, used for calculating object rotations, foreshortening in the cone of vision. Okay, so once we set up our station point, that's where it's going to be forever in the picture that we're creating, unless we change all of it. So the elements of creating linear perspective need to remain the same for the individual drawing, unless we create a new one, right? So once we decide where our center of vision is at and our station point is, those two things have to stay the same. And the center of vision is at the picture plane, so the picture plane has to remain the same. And then we have the distance, right? So that distance needs to remain the same. So the distance line is the distance between the picture plane, the center of vision, where the line of sight intersects the picture plane, to the eye, to the eyeball. And I say eyeball because a picture is not developed using two eyes. It's developed using only a single eye, and it's not using periphery vision. It's using the standard vision from the forward element of the eye. So we have both periphery vision and standard vision, and periphery just gives us a sort of context to the rest of the world as we're walking around, so we can tell if something's coming at us from the side. But it is not the main area of focus. So we draw within the main area of focus of the eye. But the distance line is the distance between the center of vision and the station point. So basically it's the distance from the eye to the picture plane along the line of sight, as long as the line of sight is parallel. So we take that distance, and that distance is very important. Now that distance always exists, but we need it on the surface of the picture plane. So we take whatever that distance is and we flop it down onto the picture plane so that we can now use that distance. And those of you that have taken my classes or have watched other videos on how to set up a linear perspective construct, this is one of the main points of linear perspective. We need that measurement, and the only way we can get that measurement is by taking the 3D space and collapsing it down onto the picture plane. It's the same distance, it's just at a specific distance from the eye now, and we can now utilize it to calculate foreshortening in space. Okay, so we have our station point, which is the eye. We have our center of vision, which is the intersection of the line of sight that is parallel to the ground with the picture plane, where the center of vision and the horizon line now meet. We have the distance line that goes between those 2 points. We need those things in order to calculate our cone of vision. All right, so we discussed cone of vision. We discussed the 3 elements that you need in order to calculate a cone of vision. And those things need to stay the same if we're going to continue with our perspective construct. They need to always be the same for that image. If they change, then everything changes. Okay. And then we have our lens types, right? So our lens types go from short, standard to long. And I have them grouped within a certain range of millimeters, which have a certain cone of vision or field of view, which we'll talk about in a minute. Generally, 10 to 25 millimeter is like a fisheye. It generally has distortion, and it's all about the foreground space. So you see like a skateboarder, the person that is actually filming a skateboarder they're using a fisheye lens, and they're super close to the person that they're trying to film. So it's all about the distortion. It's all about the action. We also have action cams that use fisheye lenses, like your GoPros. Those are using fisheye style lenses. They're definitely more action oriented. They help with shakiness. So the wider the angle of the wider angle of the lens, the shorter the lens, the less you notice bouncing and stuff like that in action shots. But the closer you need to be to the subject, so it can be dangerous. A standard lens is generally 35 to 55, and it's familiar and non-distorted. This is how we see the world in general. Now, creating a picture, it's not how the eye sees, because we're not painting a picture or drawing a picture that has binocular lens. We have a monocular lens that we're creating. So it's how the one eye sees, or how we generally want to interpret how the eye sees. But it's not really how the eye sees, but it's as close as we can get. This will be things like medium shots. You want to take a picture of a conversation between 2 people, or you want to make the viewer feel like they're really inside the scene. You'll use a standard lens. A longer lens is more for taking distant shots, generally for establishing shots, although we can use a standard lens for establishing shots as well. but we would be much closer to the subject using a standard lens than we would a long lens. So a long lens allows for distance. It tends to flatten the shapes, and it magnifies the image that's being taken. So it'll take a smaller frustum of your view, and then it magnifies it so we can still see that distant object in the detail that we need. So think about binoculars or a telescope or something like that. That's more what you're getting with your long lens. So let's talk about the cone of vision and how it relates to these millimeters. So if we look up here, let me try to zoom in so you guys can see this a little bit better. We have the cone of vision. So let's just look at this 1-point perspective construct here. We have the center line, we have the horizon line, and we have the center of vision. Remember, the center of vision is where the line of sight meets the picture plane, and the center line divides left to right, the horizon line divides up and down at the eye, if the line of sight was parallel to the ground. And then remember, we have to flip this 3D space down onto a 2D picture so that we can then use the distance from the CV to the station point, which would normally be in 3D space. It would be coming out at us, but we need that distance to be flopped down onto the picture plane so that we can actually use that measurement. And the distance between the center of vision and the station point is the distance line. So with all that said, our canvas, our picture plane, is what we're trying to find out is going to be a drawing with inside that picture plane, that portal into the world that we're trying to create. So I usually call it the picture plane portal. We're trying to see whether the canvas size that I'm creating is going to be within what we call standard perspective. So standard is anything that is not short. So standard to long lenses would be non-distorted or correct, what we would call correct perspective. So let's look at this little diagram right here, but we're gonna take a little bit further. We're gonna make it a little bit smaller so that we can iconify this concept. But still notice we have the center of vision, we have the distance line, and we have the station point down here. Now we calculate the cone of vision from the station point, and if we calculated 90 degrees from the eye, which would be 45 on the left and 45 on the right, where those two angles intersect from the eye, intersect the horizon line from the eye, we would then go from the center of vision with a compass. So you'd put the sharp end here, and then you'd put the pencil end here, and then you'd just make a circle. And any canvas within inside that space that's touching the 90-degree field of view would be a wider lens. Okay. If we want something that's more standard, we would look for something that's a little bit more 60-degree field of view. So that means from the eye, so the station point to the center of vision, we would take a protractor and we would measure 30 degrees on both sides, which would give us a total degree from the eye, a cone from the eye that's facing outward towards the picture plane. Where those two 30-degree marks meet, that would be exactly 60 degrees apart. Those 2 points would be 60 degrees apart from the eye. And then we'd put the sharp end of the compass on the center of vision, and we'd put the pencil end here, and then we'd create a circle. And anything that I would draw with inside that circle would be considered standard perspective, a full frame 30 millimeter lens, which creeps in on the standard angle, right? So usually when you calculate a 60-degree field of view, you put the canvas inside of it, slightly away from the edges to get a 35 millimeter lens. So basically what it comes down to is the further away you get from the edge of your cone of vision, the longer the lens. Okay, so we have 60-degree field of view right here, and then inside that we're looking at 30-degree field of view, which is going to give us about a 65 millimeter lens, right? So if we're looking at 35 to 55 millimeter lens, that means that the canvas edges should be within the 60-degree and the 30-degree field of view. So if I created a canvas, my canvas would be something like that, and I can probably say that that would be somewhere between 35 and 55 millimeters, which is standard. Okay, and then if we calculate this 30 degrees right here, that means it's 15 degrees on either side of the center line, right here on either side of the distance line. So we would go 15 degrees to the right, 15 degrees to the left. That would be a total of 30 degrees difference between both of those points. We'd put the sharp end here, the pencil end here, and then we would make our circle. Now if we want a long lens, and we'll get to this, this will get kind of interesting here in a second. If we want a long lens, we're looking at something like a 10-degree field of view. So between 10 and 15 degree field of view is going to give you between 200 millimeter and 80 millimeter. So basically from the station point, we have our center line here. We would take our protractor and then we would calculate 5 degrees on either side of the center line. That would be a total of 10 degrees. We'd put the sharp end in the center of vision and the pencil end on the other side. We'd create a circle, and any canvas we put in that area would be essentially a 200 millimeter lens or a long lens. So okay, so now that we've got sort of the ideas of lenses down, and what their millimeter sizes are and why they work, and how they work, let's go ahead and look at the perspective construct. So what I like to do is I like to always create a 60-degree field of view. If I always create a 60-degree cone of vision, which is, remember, we got our station point here, we have our distance line or our center line, which are the same. They're interchangeable to the center of vision. If I calculate 30 degrees from the eye out to the right and I put a mark, I know that that's 30 degrees to the right, and then if I do that again to the left, that would be 30 degrees to the left. So essentially all I have to do is create one point on the horizon line that's half of the field of view that I want. So if I want 60 degrees, I will calculate from the center here, from the station point, 30 degrees to the right. And we'll get into this. I'll show you guys how to do this in a minute. But that's 30 degrees to the right, which will give us a 60-degree cone of vision if we put the metal, the sharp point, the pinpoint on the center of vision, and the pencil edge on that 60-degree mark on the horizon line, and then we create a circle. We'll get a 60-degree field of view. Okay, so with that said, notice the proportion between the station point to the 60-degree cone of vision to the center of vision. The proportion between the station point, the 60-degree cone of vision, and the center of vision. Over here, the distance between, or the proportional distance between the station point, the center, or the cone of vision, and the center of vision. It always remains the same. So no matter how small the canvas is within inside this construct, or no matter how I scale the construct around the canvas, that proportion of 60-degree field of view will always remain the same. This is just important because if I create a 60-degree cone of vision and I put a canvas that's really small within inside that construct, I know that I'll be creating a longer lens, because remember, a 10-degree field of view is smaller and it creates a 200 millimeter lens, right? If I create a 30-degree field of view, I get a 65 millimeter lens, which is about that big. So anything that I create, the smaller I create this canvas, the longer the lens is going to be comparatively to the linear perspective construct that I have here. So I will always have the same distance between the center of vision and the station point in relationship to the cone of vision if I'm creating a 60-degree field of view. And now this works because now all I have to do is judge. I have to mentally evaluate this instead of specifically calculate that field of view. I know that if the canvas is really small, I'm looking at a much longer lens compared to the 60-degree cone of vision. I know that if my canvas is hugging the 60-degree cone of vision, that I'm looking at something like a 30 to 35 millimeter lens. So if I say that this is 100 millimeters and this here in relationship to the cone of vision is 30, then somewhere in between would be 65 and so on, right? Then if my perspective construct is still the same, right, relationally, proportionally, but my canvas is larger than the 60-degree cone of vision, we're looking at a shorter lens, something that's more wide angle. And there's a few things to note about this. One, the canvas size did not change even though the construct did. So all I did was in Photoshop is I took that construct and I scaled it up compared to the canvas. So the canvas stayed the same, the construct changes. The proportion between the CV, the SP, and the initial 60-degree cone of vision point stays consistent within the construct. So we were just talking about that. Number 3, the proportional difference between the canvas outer dimensions versus the construct is what determines the lens type and therefore dictates the level of distortion of the final feeling of the space. And I say feeling because we just want a feeling, right? We're looking at making the viewer feel distant, and looking onto the space. With a longer lens, we're looking at the viewer being in the space with the standard, and we're looking at more action or more spy. Like I'm close to the space, but possibly not a human, so I might be a camera looking in on the space, or a spy that planted a camera, or things like that, right? So the feeling that we're after, and these can all change and they're interchangeable, but in general, those are sort of the feelings that we can get from it. All right, now we have the number 4, which is the cone of vision is worthless if you do not constantly employ all the technical aspects of the chosen construct. So if I create all this and I don't add measure points and a vanishing point that uses those measure points to calculate foreshortening, which we'll talk about in a later lesson, then essentially I've done this all for nothing. And I might as well have just sketched without worrying about the cone of vision altogether, right? Okay, so now that we've got all that in our brains, let's go ahead and create some examples that will help us sort of embody this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create these from scratch and then do it, and then I'll take the sketch that I have down here and then I will reverse engineer this to see what type of cone of vision that I want. Now, I'm not going to create a foreshortened grid with this cone of vision. I'm just going to show you how I could calculate the cone of vision, and then later we will create a grid based on how big the canvas is compared to the 60-degree cone of vision. Now, before we move on, you can actually create a 10-degree field of view if I want cone of vision, just by going from the eye, taking a protractor, and then doing 5 degrees on either side, which is just 5 degrees on one side, which would end up about right here. Then put the pointy end here at the center of vision and the pencil end here, and then just make a circle. And then we know that this canvas is a little bit shorter than 200 millimeters because, remember, 10-degree field of view is about 200 millimeters from this up here, from this little diagram that I made. Now, I made this diagram based on Nikon's. They have a field of view chart for full-frame lenses, which you can get into later if you want. But I got all this data from this URL right here, and then I just calculated it with the field of view that I set up in this diagram. All right. So let's get moving. So now that we have all this stuff in our mind, let's move forward and actually create some stuff. All right, so I just created a new layer, and I'm going to start off with a center line because the center line is really, really important. Let's actually make this, let's zoom in a little bit so that the thickness of the line makes more sense. So we'll start off with a center vision. A center line. I'm just making it really long just for illustration purposes, we will actually cut it off when we feel like we've got the right cone of vision. Then I'm just going to make an extra long horizon line. I held the space bar. Once you start drawing something and you hold shift, it will constrain it to 45 degrees. And then I hold down the space bar to move it around like that. And then I release the space bar so that I can get a line where I want it. So now I'm going to just define the station point. I'm going to say that the station point is right here. This is arbitrary. So this is the first way, right? So the first way is to arbitrarily place the station point, and then I can calculate the cone of vision from there. So if I draw a line from the station point up to the center of vision, notice that the little label to the upper right of my cursor, it has an angle degree, right? So if I wanted to, I would go 30 degrees to the right. So right now it's 90, 80, 70, 60. All right, so we're at 60 degrees right now. So I'll just drop that line. Let's actually put that line on a different layer. And I need to make this a little bit longer. Not sure why it's doing that. Here, let's just copy this. Sorry about this, you guys. All right, so we are going to put this on a different layer. And I'm just going to use this temporarily, and then we will give this a color. So this is on a separate layer, and we said 60 degrees to the right, so 90 is straight up, which means that 60 degrees to the right is going to be accurate. All right. So this angle right here, from here to here, is 30 degrees. So from the center to the side over here is 30 degrees, which means that if I just copy this, if I just copy it and flip it, we now have 30 degrees on the right, which means that the total amount of degrees would be 60, right? So that means that wherever this line meets that edge, from the center over to that line is a 30 degree difference from the eye, right? So the eye is right here, and it is looking in this direction. So this likens to it's just a cone. So if I put a little dude here, right, and he's got an eye, this is the vision, and then basically what we're doing is we're saying that from this 0 degree point right here, 30 degrees down and 30 degrees up would be our view frustum. So anything that resides within this space is going to be projected either to the picture plane, so let's say the picture plane's right there, or it would be projected up and back to the picture plane, right? So this would be where the view, so let's say there's a person here. Let's just make another head here. Right, so if I have person A and person B, then that means that everything that is below this line is not going to actually show up on our picture. And everything that is above this line or within this space will show up on our picture. That's all. That's the only thing that we're doing here is we're saying that if I make this cone of vision wider by a certain degree, that means that more foreground area will actually show up on the picture plane, because now this dude is like all the way in the picture, right? So now all of this space is going to be projected, and it's going to cause a lot of distortion. So his head's going to be really big on the picture, and his feet are going to be really small, right? That's just sort of how it works. So let's get rid of that real quick. I should have put that on another layer. I keep doing that. All right, so we have our 30 degree on either side, our field of view. Now we can create a we can now create our cone of vision. So we're going to start from our center of vision. So I'm going to start drawing, and then if I hold shift, it'll keep it proportional. And this is the same thing as having a compass with the sharp end here. So let's do this. So we have our sharp end of our compass here, you know, and then whatever, it'll keep going up, and then we'll have, you guys know what a compass looks like, right? It looks like this. And then on the other side, that will come out, and then it'll have this little attachment, and then we will put our pencil in here, and so on that side, and then we can make a circle. Did I make that on another layer? I didn't, did I? Oh my goodness. Here, let me get this on another layer, and I'll finish that up so I can keep bringing it up to show you guys. All right, so what in the world just happened? All right. So we've got our pencil on one side, we've got and then in the middle there's like that little handle that you can use to rotate it. So we've got our needle on this side, we've got our pencil on that side, and so that's how it works. You open it up, you put the needle in the center of vision, you put the pencil there, and then you rotate that, and then you've got your cone of vision. Now that I have my cone of vision, I could say, and I know it's 60 degrees, right? So this cone of vision is in fact 60 degrees. Right? In fact, that's what it is. That's just how it is, right? So if I make a canvas, which in general you want to make your canvas around the center of vision, if I make my canvas out here, it's much harder to control. It's not a very stable image. So you want to make sure that it is surrounding the center of vision. So I know that this canvas, although it is right leaned, over here we're starting to get more towards the 60 degree cone of vision, and back here we're starting to get more towards the 200 degree cone of vision, right? So all of our images will have all of the degrees in it, but the further out the image is, these areas will start tipping into the maximum range of the cone of vision. If I made a canvas this small, like that, that's probably a 200 degree field of vision, or 200 millimeter 200 millimeter lens, a 10-degree field of vision. If I decide to make the canvas bigger than the cone of vision, then anything that's outside of that cone of vision is going to be highly distorted. So we're going to start getting into more of the cues of a wide-angle lens, right? So this would be a long lens, this would be a standard lens, and this would be a short lens, right? So long lens LL, short lens SL. Wait, why did I do that? Oh yeah, short lens, and then this is standard lens. All right, I hope that makes sense. So that would be, if I wanted to create a canvas that is a very particular size for a particular reason, then I would immediately make my construct, and then I would set my canvas up the way that I want, and then I would start drawing within inside that space. Knowing, see, this is the power of knowing this during a sketch, is I know that this is about standard. So if I was to just do a single point perspective image, I could quickly sketch something that has the feeling of a standard lens. So the more you get used to it, the more that this is possible, right? So a longer lens looks different. It has different scale cues. It has different depth cues than a standard lens. So a standard lens is going to give me, it's going to give me some foreshortening that's like this. Whereas a longer lens would give us, a foreshortening that's closer to this, right? To almost not existing, right? So basically, if I drew an image out here and then I wanted to crop in, I would be changing the lens size, right? So if I created all this image out here and then I created all the foreshortening back in space, and then I decided that I wanted to change the lens, all I'd have to do if I already created the grid is crop into it and then redraw everything here. There are some technical issues with that, but overall, I hope that makes sense. And then I could continue with my grid outside of this space. Sorry, this is just for illustration purposes, so please forgive the inaccuracy. Just understand that I'm illustrating a point, right? So I'm going to extend this grid outward in a logical manner, right? So I'm using logic based on my experience with this, that foreshortening, it gets smaller as you go back in space. The length of things get longer as you come forward in space. So this unit would be right about there, right? So right here, this looks like a perfect square. This looks like a perfect square in space. That looks like a perfect square as it goes back. So we understand that if I say that that's a perfect square going back in space, it looks accurate. Even this one, it looks like a perfect square here, but then once we get out of here, it starts to pinch, and then it no longer looks like a perfect square. Up here, this looks accurate, but then out here, it starts to distort, and we get a lot of pinching. It's still stretched, because anything that is foreshortened, anything that's going back in space will never be as long as what it is flat towards the space, right? So if my arm is this long going back in space foreshortened, it might be that long. It would never be this same length going back in space, right? Because if it was, it wouldn't look foreshortened. So that looks much deeper going back into space. If I say that's going to like a vanishing point back here, that looks much longer than this looks right here. I just had an earthquake. Sweet. I'm alive. All right, so that space, it just so happens that that looks longer and distorted because I'm saying that this distance and that distance is the same. So the illusion is that that does not look the same, or it looks like a wide-angle lens because it's so distorted. It's outside of the perspective grid. So the rule of thumb is, you know, whatever that length is, you always shrink it going back in space if you want that same length back in space. So the longer the lens right back here, the shorter that space will be. So if I'm using a 200 millimeter lens and I have whatever this length is, I might only take 1/10 of it and bring it up back, and then I can call that a perfect square, right? But if I'm doing this in a standard lens, I might take a third of it and then put it back in space. So these are just concepts. These are just ideas that seem to be correct based on my experience with perspective. So I've learned to estimate a lot of things as a result of my years of working with perspective. And so now that looks more like a standard square. That looks more like I just made a square in space, and this length and that length and that length and that length are all exactly the same. So that's essentially what we're doing in perspective. We're trying to calculate squares in space that are perfectly accurate so that we know that that's 1 unit by 1 unit. And if that's 1 unit by 1 unit, we can then draw something. Now, if I say that that 1 unit is 10 feet, back here I might not actually be able to make that 10-foot unit, because back here it's much harder to make a unit because it's too flat, right? So these foreshortened spaces, they get smaller and smaller to a point where we can't even register them to the eye. It's the radius of disappearance, so I won't even know. Like, the next one is going to be the last one I can create before they all jumble. So then what I would have to do is I would have to take 10 of these, which would be 100 units, and then I'd have to foreshorten that. So that would be 100 units. This would be 200 units. That would be 300 units back, so on and so forth. So we went from 10 units from here to here to 100 units from here to here, and look at how quickly it's shortening. So by the time we get back here, each of the squares might be, each of these squares that we create back here might be, 1,000 units or 1,000 feet. So anyway, I hope that makes sense. So if I'm creating a space, and I know what type of lens I want, but I don't know exactly what I want the space to feel or to look like, what I'll do is I'll actually create the space first. I'll create I'll create the construct first. I'll create the cone of vision. I'll put the frame where I want it. That's going to lead the eye in a specific direction. And then I'll create the grid, whether it's 1, 2, or even 3-point perspective. I'll create the grid, and then I'll start sketching with inside that grid in order to show a space. Right? But if I already have a scene developed that I sketched out already, I will already sort of identify this as a longer lens. It's the horizon line is up higher. I'm seeing this large-scaled object and this medium-scale object in the same view, and this might be more of an 80 millimeter lens rather than a 200, because I can still see underneath the object here. It's not just a big flat shape. There's some perspective depth to the to this object. There's also some perspective distortion up here too. There's some distance here. There's distance from there to there, but it's a very long distance in a small amount of space. So that's giving me also the height of these doors, these big large doors back here compared to the mech that we've got back here, compared to the building, compared to the human height back here. This is telling me that this is more of a longer lens, because I can put a character right here and back here and they'll almost be the exact same height no matter what distance they're at. That character will still probably be a similar height. It does not fall off quick enough for me to say that it is a shorter lens. So a shorter lens, I would have the character would be much bigger in the foreground and then much smaller right here, than the character being small here and about the same size here, and then back here it would foreshorten obviously, so it'd be smaller, but the scale, the actual 2D size of it would be negligent. It would fall off much slower. So that would be a much larger or longer lens. A standard lens would have something in between that, right? So I'm going to say that this is a long lens. It's about 80 millimeter. And 80 millimeter to me, actually to everybody. So let me bring in that little cheat sheet that I have over here. So if I'm looking at this chart over here on the left, "30 degrees is around 65 and 10 degrees is around 200. So somewhere in the proportional space, that is, if I have the 60-degree cone of vision here, halfway from the 60 degrees to the center of vision is the 30 degrees, right? So if I take that degree, halfway in between is 30 less degrees. And then a little more than halfway from that one will be the 10 degree mark. So let's go ahead and apply this here. So let's just use this to give us what I'm talking about. So if I know that this is a 60-degree cone of vision, so this is 60 degrees, that means that about halfway between the center of vision and the cone of vision is going to be a 30-degree cone of vision, right? 30-degree cone of vision. This would actually be only 15 degrees from the center, so we'd have 15 degrees before it reached, that point on the horizon line. But in total, it would be 30 degrees, which means that half of that would be 15 degrees, and then a little more would be 10, because half of that would be 7.5, right? So it's really easy to start to develop an idea of what these measurements look like. So now what we'll do is we'll create a few more shapes to kind of embody what I'm talking about. So if we go from the center of vision, hold down Shift to create a proportional circle, that would be around 15 degrees. And this next one would be around 30 degrees. So I just calculated that by eyeball after I had my 60-degree cone of vision. I just said, well, that's half, and that's half of that, and then this is a little bit. And if this one is, if this one right here is going to give me a 65 millimeter, this one right here is going to give me a 30 millimeter, and a 10 degree down here is going to give me a 200 millimeter. That means that somewhere along here is going to give me 80. So let's just say that this is going to be an 80 millimeter. Oops. What did I just do? 80 millimeter lens, which is going to be somewhere between 30 and 15, which could be like 22.5 degree cone of vision, will give me around an 80 millimeter. So if I create a canvas that's inside that 80 degree, or sorry, that 80 millimeter mark, which can be on either side, that means that I now know the canvas size of what is going to give me this sort of lens that I'm looking at here. So now I'm going to calculate the proportional difference between my station point and my center of vision, and it looks like my canvas is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, almost 17. So it's 1/17 from the center of vision to the bottom of that canvas right there. So 1/17. So I need to calculate wherever my center of vision is going to be. I need to calculate 7 of those distances from my center of vision to the bottom of my canvas. I need to calculate 17 of those and then create a station point, but over here. Okay. So let's go ahead and do that. So my canvas, let's go ahead and let's find my horizon line. Sorry, gotta put that back on pixels. All right, so let's find that horizon line. So I'm just tracing over my... What in the world is happening? Just tracing my perspective lines, the major lines that I created based on observation. And it looks like my center line will be right there. Although I want to move it to the left a little bit, so I'm just going to move it to the left, and since this is a sketch, it's fine, I can change it. I want to create the focal point right here at this mech. So we have a low horizon line. So now I'll go ahead and... Yeah, so it seems to work pretty well here. Now the mech top is rotated a little bit for interest, so I'm not using the mech as my as an object that I'm going to evaluate. That's actually going to be in 2-point. So we now have our convergence point, and we have our horizon line. I usually make it blue because the ocean is something that we are all familiar with, and that's where you can, out of all the places on Earth, that's where you can see the horizon line most clearly. So I just make the horizon line blue, and then I'll pick an orange for the distance line. So I'm just going to go directly straight down. Now remember, we decided that my station point is 17 of the units between the center of vision to the edge of the canvas down. So let's go ahead and create that. And then that will give us our station point, and then we can calculate our cone of vision. So we've already basically calculated our cone of vision in the other image, in that little mock-up space. So we already know where we're headed with this. 2, 3, 4, 5. All right. So in the interests of speed, I now have 5 units. I now have 10 units. I now have 15 units. And I'm actually going to only make this 16 units down instead of 17, because at that level it's sort of negligent. If I added another unit, it's still going to be around the same distortion. And then we're going to add the station point here at 16 units. But 16 units will give us something that is equally divisible. It's much easier to measure using 16 as opposed to 15, right? So if I wanted to multiply or divide a space, 15 units is harder to divide than 16, because 16 is divisible by 2, whereas 1, 3, 5, 7 is not. All right, so general math stuff, right? All right, so now that we've got that 1/17th, we've got the 1/17th up here, and we've got 17 down below, or 1/16th. We now have a viable place for our station point, and then we can, just to check our answer, because, I mean, we did it over here. We already decided what was happening over here based on using our cheat sheet for our millimeters and calculating about how big the canvas is going to be. And then I made the same proportional canvas over here that I have on that drawing over there. So I have a good idea of what this construct should look like. And we should get a 60-degree cone of vision, or even we'll do a 15-degree cone so that you can see, and then we'll do a 30-degree, and then we'll do a 60-degree so that you guys can see how the cones work. All right, so we'll grab our circle or our line tool. We're going to make this one blue. We'll add another layer, make sure it's pixels, and then I'm going to increase its thickness. All right, so this is 90. So if I want 15 degrees, or I want a 30-degree cone of vision, then I need to go 15 degrees to the right. So 80, and then 75. 75 is going to give us that 30-degree mark. So basically what's happening is I'm doing 15 degrees on the right, which is automatically going to give me 15 degrees on the left. And then I'll do 30. So from the eye, come up and I'll do 30. So that would be 60 from 90. So 90 minus 30 is 60. Right? So we did 30. So this is a 60-degree cone of vision. This is a 30-degree. And now let's do that 10-degree. So we'll do 5 on both sides. So 85. So 90 minus 5 is 85. And now we can then start adding our cone of vision. So from the center of vision, hold shift to constrain proportion. This is basically our compass. And then where that point meets the horizon line, not along this edge right here, where that point is on the horizon line, where the angled line meets the horizon line, that point, that's where we draw out to. So that is our 10-degree. This is our 30-degree. And this is our 60-degree. So notice how the focal point is within the 10-degree, which is going to give us a 200 millimeter right around there. So if I cropped my canvas in there, it'd be 200 millis. And then we have our 30-degree here, which is 30 degree is a 65 milli, remember? So everything inside here is below 65 or above 65 to 200, right? And then we have our 60 degree out here, which we're going away from that, which is giving us around an 85 millimeter right here. So we get 85, we got 65, and we've got 200 with inside here. And I think that that's fine because this, maybe I need to. Let's go ahead and now that we've got all of this lined up, I don't feel that that's right because based on what our agreement was over here that we want the canvas to be below 30 degree field of view, so it's a longer lens. Sorry, I'm trying to. I'm going to rasterize these. Wait. Sorry, the vectors are giving me some troubles here. I have to rasterize each one of these first. All right, so this is our local perspective construct. And what we can do is I hit free transform, Control T, and since I haven't measured anything, and all we're trying to calculate is the station point relative to the canvas using our cone of vision as our guide. I Control T'd it. I put the center of the transform at the center of vision, and we are going to increase the size until the whole canvas is inside the 30 degree field of view point. Right? So what I did is I just made sure that the edge of the canvas was inside this 30 degree cone of view. And we need to expand the canvas in order to get our station point back. There we go. And I had to get my background layer and pull that back more. So why did this work? And how does this work? All right, so we're talking about reverse engineering your technical perspective, your linear perspective construct in order to give you the distortion that you want, the lens that you want in a sketch that you already created. So a lot of this in here is going to have to actually change. Once I make my grid from that station point using measure points that are calculated based on my knowledge of the cone of vision relative to the station point, now I can begin creating a grid and then start to manipulate the objects within inside that grid in order to give me the right scale. So this is just a feeling. The original sketch was just a feeling I had, and I went for it to get a sort of shot and a feeling that I wanted, but now it's time to actually get busy and fix all of the depth issues that are in here. And so now I would create a grid on the ground that's properly foreshortened, based on information that we're going to give you in later lessons. So this was just about cone of vision, what its uses are, how to use it, how to create it, how to think about it, and what it's like, what in general the cone of vision is good for, right? So let's recap. The cone of vision is good for calculating lens types. They're good for deciding on a feeling in your image. So there's a lot of this technical aspect of linear perspective just to give you guys the tools you need in order to know that when I calculate my perspective grid, my properly foreshortened perspective grid, that all of the units are going to foreshorten at the rate that the lens that I chose would naturally foreshorten. So if I had a specific lens and I put it on my camera and I took a picture of the scene as if this scene would really exist, even though it doesn't. If I took a picture of a scene, the scene that I draw and the scene that I took a picture of should accurately be foreshortened similarly. However, drawing is different than cinematography. Cinematography is all about what actually exists. So when I take my camera and I go outside, things already exist. Painting a picture is about making you believe that something that doesn't exist actually exists. And this is a key tool that you can use to make people believe that something exists even though it really doesn't. So you're creating these imaginative pieces, and you need the cone of vision in order to decide how your viewer is going to receive the visual information that you're trying to give them. Even if you do sketches first, you have to reverse engineer that to create something that's an accurate perspective. Things will change from your sketch. So just be loose with your sketch, but tight enough to where people know what's going on, but loose enough to where you're not in love with it, because you will have to change it once you start putting your perspective grid in and you realize how off your guesses were. Now, the more you do this, the more on your guesses will be. And so this particular sketch isn't too far off from the lens that we just chose. But when I first started, my sketches and my perspective grids were so far off that eventually, over time of using this technique, I started to realize how far off I was, and I became more familiar with how to choose lenses. Now, I don't even create the 30 degree and the 10 degree. I'll create the 60 degree, and then I'll just put my canvas inside the space based on the lens, based on the degree that I feel it should be, based on my experience. And that's something that you'll get used to over time. I will be redrawing this at some point, and I'll continue with this particular exercise in order to show you how to create a grid and reverse engineer your sketches. But essentially, what I've been talking about today is all about lenses. It's all about cone of vision and how they relate to lenses, and how to actually specify which lens you're using based on your linear construct, based on the center of vision, the station point, and the distance line, and how they create a cone of vision that will give you either a standard, a short, or a long lens. So let's recap at the very beginning. We talked about the cone of vision only existing within the center of vision, station point, and distance line. So those all have to remain the same for the cone of vision to work. And how, when I foreshorten space based on those specifics, I will either get a short, a standard, or a long lens. A short lens is between 20 and 25 millimeter. We get fisheye distortion. Standard lens is between 35 and 55 millimeter. It's familiar, not a lot of distortion. And a long lens is between 80 and 200 millimeter. It's distant and it has flat shapes. So the feeling that I'm trying to get here is that we are looking in on this place. We are not actually in there just yet. This is an establishing shot. The next scene, you will actually be in the view, and I will use something more of a standard lens in order to show more of a feeling of I'm actually in the space rather than I'm looking in on it in wow, right? In awe. Okay, you guys, so thank you so much for watching this. I hope that you got a lot out of it. Please subscribe to the channel. Make sure that you click that like button. If you disliked it, go ahead and click that as well. Let me know what you think in the comments. And that helps. Actually, those subscriptions and those likes and dislikes and being active in the comments really help me to make more of these videos and make them and do more editing. Right now, it has no editing at all. So later on, as the channel develops, I'll be able to edit these down a little bit more so that they're less daunting and more direct and to the point. So, so please go ahead and subscribe. Please leave comments, and please hit those thumbs up to help support the channel and help bring in more tutorials with more editing and more of what you like. So. All right, you guys, we'll talk to you soon. Take care.